This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Today, I wanted to start out talking about the film Robert F. Williams and Black Power. The film is called Negroes with Guns. And unfortunately, we have a technological glitch, and the film is not going to be available. But you were able to hear a little bit of Robert F. Williams' voice. And I wanted to use that as a starting point to get into a discussion about Stokely Carmichael and the rise of the Black Power consciousness in 1966. For Stokely Carmichael, as a student at Howard University, Robert F. Williams was a major factor in his transformation. At a time when Williams had gained attention for challenging the commitment to nonviolence of most of the movement. He had argued for armed self-defense during the late 1950s as the leader of an NAACP chapter in Monroe, North Carolina. And this, of course, had raised the ire of the leaders of the NAACP, who had suspended Robert F. Williams, which made him more of a national figure. And he engaged in a public debate with Martin Luther King over King's nonviolence versus Robert F. Williams' insistence upon the right of black Americans to use arms to defend themselves. Now, this is at a time when Malcolm X was not really very much of a factor. Very few people had heard of Malcolm X. So Robert F. Williams plays this role of arguing against this philosophical commitment to nonviolence. Now, tactically, he understands that in the South you have to use nonviolent tactics most of the time, but he does argue very strongly that if attacked, you should be prepared to defend yourself. Furthermore, in 1961, he gains attention because he, in the midst of the debate about Cuba, the UN ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, had deplored the betrayal, Castro's betrayal of the Cuban Revolution. And he said that the United States reserved the right to send assistance, military if necessary, to any people struggling anywhere for human rights and democratic freedoms. Well, Robert F. Williams uses this as an opportunity to write a letter to the UN ambassador, and he said, "Mr. Ambassador, please convey the following appeal. Now that the United States has proclaimed military support for people willing to rebel against oppression, oppressed Negroes in the American South urgently request tanks, artillery, bombs, money, and the use of American airfields and white mercenaries to crush the racist tyrants who have betrayed the American Revolution and the Civil War. We request the world's prayers for this noble undertaking." Robert F. Williams, President, NAACP, Monroe, North Carolina. Wow. Well, the students at Howard reacted very positively to this, and for Stokely Carmichael, this was a sign that the movement was changing. Now, one way of getting into this discussion would be to look at Stokely Carmichael and the group at Howard University as a developing faction within SNCC. At that time, most of the influence within SNCC came from the Nashville chapter. And the Nashville chapter, as you know, was heavily influenced by James Lawson, who emphasized Gandhian nonviolence. And in fact, he was probably even more equipped than King to push the Gandhian ideas because he had actually been to India and studied Gandhian ideas. And out of that Nashville chapter came the early leadership of SNCC. People like John Lewis, who becomes SNCC's first chairman, Diane Nash, James Bevel. All of these people kind of came out of this workshop that James Lawson had organized. And James Lawson wrote the initial statement of purpose of SNCC. So SNCC itself was deeply committed to kind of James Lawson's vision of a nonviolent revolution. And probably the most influential member of SNCC, Diane Nash, was a protege of James Lawson. At the same time, though, there were sit-ins at many colleges. And one of the reasons why Stokely Carmichael, as a student from New York, comes to Howard University is because he wants to get involved in this expanding movement. So he arrives in the fall of 1960 at a time when Howard students are getting involved in sit-ins in the DC area. And what happens during a spring semester is that the Freedom Rides begin. Now, as you know, the story of the Freedom Rides from the Eyes on the Prize film, after the initial group of Freedom Riders are assaulted in Alabama, Diane Nash organizes students and puts in a call to Howard University to a group called the Nonviolent Action Group, NAG, on the Howard campus. And the Howard students respond by sending their own contingent to go to Mississippi. And this contingent goes, instead of going to Alabama and leaving from Birmingham and going into Mississippi, they fly to New Orleans in order to, because you recall from the film, the group from Birmingham, the police were waiting for them, and they walked basically into prison. So they thought, well, we'll get around this and try to do another front on in this fight by sending a group on a train from New Orleans to Jackson. Now, it turned out that the same thing happened. You know, they couldn't really keep this secret very long, and they got arrested and went to Parchman Penitentiary. And you'll also recall from the Eyes on the Prize film, what happens in Parchman is that these students get together and begin to exchange ideas. So you have the Nashville group coming with their religious orientation, very Gandhian orientation, and then you have this group coming from Howard University, many of them from the North, many of them coming with more secular kind of radicalism, just as militant, just as dedicated to the struggle, but with a different kind of ideological orientation. So if you see what happens in Monroe, North Carolina as a natural extension of the Freedom Ride, then you can understand that, well, you know, the Freedom Riders are coming into Monroe and they're bringing this kind of Gandhian sense of nonviolence, but they're being met by Robert F. Williams, who at a crucial point when the Freedom Riders are being attacked, he comes in with his followers in the NAACP chapter armed and prepared to confront the Klan. And this results in basically a riot that takes place in Monroe. A white couple who happened to be driving through Monroe at the time and get in the middle of this, Robert F. Williams takes them into his home. He is later charged with kidnapping them. So therefore, the FBI is after him. He goes into exile with this kidnapping charge hanging over his head. He goes to Canada, then to Cuba. From Cuba, Castro welcomes him and sees him as a way of kind of getting back at the U.S. government for its hostility, and which include, you know, an invasion attempt in 1961 and later on an assassination attempt against Castro. So he wants to welcome Robert F. Williams, gives him a radio program on Radio Havana, which he calls Radio Free Cuba. And he begins broadcasting despite the U.S. boycott, it begins broadcasting from Cuba, publishing a newspaper called The Crusader, and essentially arguing for a more militant direction in the movement. Robert F. Williams becomes the kind of symbol of this emerging militancy within the struggle, and the Nashville and the group at Howard are not about to abandon nonviolence, but what they see in Robert F. Williams is that they want to move away from this kind of philosophical commitment that everybody in the movement has to be philosophically committed to nonviolence. This comes to a head actually during the summer of 1961 when SNCC holds its meeting in Nashville. In the In Struggle book, you'll see that meeting is kind of the crucial meeting where they decide whether to do voter registration or whether they want to focus on desegregation protests. Well, while that meeting is going on, they also launch protests. They continue the protests in Nashville. And meanwhile, the Nashville group has these new recruits coming in the August of 1961, all wanting to help out in carrying on the Nashville movement's campaign. During this time, Stokely Carmichael and one of the other members from Howard are on a picket line, and they get assaulted. Now, according to Stokely Carmichael's story, he said, I was committed to nonviolence, but this person came and tried to attack me, and I kind of came back and went through a plate glass window, and the window came down, and the police arrested him. But this becomes controversial for the Nashville group because these new recruits don't seem to have the same kind of commitment. They would have expected him to go limp, to do something to avoid a confrontation with this person. And instead, even though Stokely Carmichael insists, I wasn't fighting him or anything like that, but I just wasn't, I just responded to being pushed. But he ends up in jail, and you begin to see the first hints of a real split over this question of tactical nonviolence versus philosophical nonviolence. Both of them engaged in direct action, but one not trained. And this also, it's interesting that later on in the 60s, Stokely Carmichael will replace John Lewis as chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And you can see some of the tensions between the two being traced back to this early episode in 1961. And probably also the conversations that take place in Parchman Penitentiary during that summer, because then they began to exchange ideas, and the Howard group are not as determined to pray. They're more likely to use this time to discuss political philosophies. And at Howard, there is a consciousness-changing effort going on. It's called Project Awareness. And it's launched by the NAG group. And it involves bringing in speakers. One of their first speakers, for example, is Herbert Aptheker. I don't know how many of you have heard of that name. Lindsay has, because she's been in the Herbert Aptheker Library at the King Institute. Herbert Aptheker was a major theoretician of the Communist Party. And he also wrote some of the landmark books in African American history during the 1940s and 50s at a time when it was a field ignored by most scholars. He wrote about the Nat Turner Rebellion, wrote the first major book about Nat Turner's slave revolt. And he wrote a book called American Negro Slave Revolts. He worked with Du Bois during the 1940s when Du Bois was at the NAACP. And he also edited a landmark series called The Documentary History of the Negro People in the United States, 7 volumes of documents that is probably, even today, the best documentary source on African American history. Well, to bring in a communist to Howard University in 1962 was something very, very controversial, even though it was part of a debate with a person who was a non-communist. But their next decision was even more controversial, and that was to bring in Malcolm X to debate with Bayard Rustin. The Rustin-Malcolm debate, I think, was a crucial turning point because it brought in black nationalist ideas. I think that the NAG group went into the debate expecting that, that Rustin would kind of blow away Malcolm X. They were very familiar with Rustin. He was a tremendous debater, someone whose ideas, he expressed them with a great deal of force, and had already been working with the NAG group. If anything, he was kind of their informal advisor, someone who kind of pushed them toward a kind of socialist point of view that was also anti-communist. Well, the debate, which Stokely Carmichael later wrote about, I'll just read a small section from his autobiography. He said that the debate was the first time I would be seeing Malcolm X up close. Bayard we already knew. Sometimes when we had a large demonstration, he'd come and afterwards always lead a discussion. Sometimes he'd bring an African leader. But Malcolm, the racist demagogue regularly demonized all over the white press, was making his first appearance at Howard, and he was a real novelty. We met him when he got to campus. Michael Thilwell interviewed him for the newspaper, then brought him over for a little dinner we had organized for our guests. Upon his appearance in the small dining room, the atmosphere abruptly changed. Suddenly the room became totally silent, but strangely charged. The clatter of silverware, the hum of conversation, everything just stopped. All heads turned toward the door. There he stood, smiling often almost diffidently in the doorway. Tall, slender, with his horn-rimmed glasses glinting, the expression on his lean face alert, carrying himself erect with a formality, a quiet dignity in his posture, yet beneath it an unmistakable warmth. Without doing a thing for a moment, he simply commanded the entire space. Salam alaikum, brothers and sisters. Sorry if I'm a little late, but your young editors turned me every which way but loose. They were without mercy. He politely declined to eat with us, explaining that for religious reasons, he ate only one meal each day. He sat a little apart, taking cup after cup of black coffee and our endless questions. Malcolm had presence, something you could not miss, but neither could you quite name. It was a noticeable life force, an energy field, an aura, a something quite unlike any other leader I had seen until I had the honor of meeting Sékou Touré of Guinea. El Comandante Fidel Castro is a leader who also radiated a similar personal magnetism. Now, Dr. King had great charisma once he started to speak. That was the power of Nomo, the African spoken word. But before Dr. King unrolled that magnificent voice and revealed the eloquence of his moral force, he could be standing in the room and you could easily not notice him. But if Malcolm or Sékou Touré or Fidel Castro stood completely still and silent in a large crowded room, everyone knew it. There, Malcolm sat, drinking coffee and answering questions. He was unfailingly courteous, treating each questioner and his or her question with wit, care, and great respect, which put everyone at ease. Well, after that first meeting, the Stokely Carmichael continued to have some interactions with Malcolm and his followers. And as he became more involved in the struggle, began to bring not only socialist ideas, but also black nationalist ideas into the struggle. Now, Stokely had grown up as a child of immigrants from Trinidad who had immigrated to New York. He came to New York when he was 11, went to public schools in New York, got into Bronx High School of Science, which was, you had to take an exam to get in there, one of the best high schools. Very bright. I think I mentioned in Struggle that one of his friends in high school was Gene Dennis, whose father was a leader of the Communist Party who was sent to prison during the McCarthy era of the 1950s. So he was exposed to the white left at this predominantly white high school he went to. And probably if it had not been for the movement, he would have gone to a predominantly white college and probably continued to be involved in various kinds of leftist activities. For example, going to the United Nations and picketing on various issues. Things that were common in the burgeoning white left of that time. But once the sit-in started, he knew that he wanted to be part of that movement, came to Howard, but promised his parents that he would graduate. So what he would typically do is finish the school year, and whatever was going on in 1961, it was going to join the Freedom Rides, spend the rest of the summer doing that, go back to college in the fall. Next year, what's happening? Albany, Georgia, various kinds of activities in Mississippi, go and get involved in that. The summer of 1963, the same kind of thing happened of working in support of the Mississippi struggle. And it was in that context that he came to a meeting of the National Student Association that was held in Bloomington, Indiana. And he came there in order to get the national student movement to support SNCC and the Southern struggle, especially financial support. This was at a time when they were just beginning to develop the idea of the Mississippi Summer Project that was going to happen in the summer of 1964. So this meeting happened in August of 63. What else happened in August of 63? The March on Washington. So this was right before the March on Washington. And it was also the first time that I met Stokely Carmichael, because I was also at the NSA meeting. I had just finished my first year of college and wanted to get more and more involved. I was out in New Mexico. Parents had moved to New Mexico after World War II. When my father got out of the military, he became a security guard at this place which was famous for building atomic bombs. And so that's where I had grown up. And if you're going to college at the University of New Mexico and the movement is way in the South, it's pretty far away. So for me, it was an opportunity to find out more about what was going on in the South and perhaps get involved. And it didn't take very long for Stokely to find me and for me to find Stokely, because there weren't very many black students at this meeting. Probably we were a small minority of maybe 2 or 3% of the students attending. And Stokely was even then an organizer. I was immediately impressed by him. He had certain dynamic qualities, very good speaker. He was a philosophy major at Howard. And you could tell even then that he had been exposed to a lot of different things through the project awareness, the kind of people he had met. He was on a first-name basis with people like Harry Belafonte and James Baldwin had come to Howard University to speak, and of course Malcolm X and other people I had just heard about. He also had came with a background of activism, the kind of thing that many of us wanted to get involved in. Now for me, my hope that summer was to go to the March on Washington. I thought that was, I'd heard a lot about it. I wanted to find a way of getting there. And one of the things I recall is the first time I mentioned going to the march, he just kind of put it down. Like, why would you want to go there? I mean, that's just going to be a picnic, you're just sit around and listen to speeches. Why don't you come and join us in Greenwood, Mississippi? Well, at the time, the chances of me going to Greenwood, Mississippi were not that great. I mean, it was not something that I would have even conceived of kind of dropping out of school. I had the same kind of commitment to my parents. I was going to graduate. So I told him, well, look, I really hope I get to go to the march. This is about the most militant thing I've ever done in my life, so don't expect too much more. But I remember that first meeting with the people in SNCC. All of them were just really enthusiastic about what they were doing, and it put me on the defensive. Why wasn't I willing to go to Greenwood, Mississippi, or Albany, Georgia, or all these other places? What was I doing so important in school that was more important than that? Now Stokely didn't tell me I'm going back to school. At the same time he's telling me to go to Greenwood, Mississippi, he was going to finish up his senior year at Howard, but he wasn't saying that. In any case, the few SNCC representatives, there was another woman, Lucy Commissar, who was the editor of the Mississippi Free Press. I remember she spent a lot of time with me telling me about the Mississippi movement, teaching me some freedom songs, which I didn't know. And basically, all of them were recruiters. They would look upon a young black student like myself and say, you've got to be with us. You've got to come and join the movement. And it was hard to say no. But for me, it was enough going to the march. I managed to get a ride with a group from Indiana who were going to the March on Washington. Ended up going there. And you could kind of imagine for a person 19 years old showing up by myself, I knew nobody at the march, and showing up at this event that no one knew how it was going to turn out. All I did know was that it was more black people than I had seen in all my life to that point. You don't see a lot in New Mexico. And it was a really important experience. Now, one of the things I've thought about, especially since becoming editor of the King Papers, is what did I think of Martin Luther King's speech? I've been asked that question lots. And I don't really have a lot of real memories of it. I think it was so, by the end of that day, I was probably so tired and also interested in how I was going to get home. Because I had about $30 in my pocket. I had a bus ticket from Indianapolis to New Mexico, and here I was in Washington, D.C. And so I wasn't at all clear. So probably at that time, by the time King gave a speech at the end of the day, I was probably searching around trying to find a way to get home. Meanwhile, though, I remember being very, very impressed with John Lewis when he came, because even at that time, the people in SNCC were people my age. King was, this kind of charismatic figure. We had all heard about him. We all admired him. But the idea that the SNCC people and that a person close to my age was up there on the podium speaking with the rest of these leaders, that was what was impressive. And I think we were all very proud of him. Of course, later on, when I interviewed him, found out what went on behind the scenes, which is in the books about his censoring of his speech. That was something I would not have known about at that point. I thought about this when Clarence Jones spoke in this class, and I was just thinking of just the remarkable coincidence that I was sitting down probably less than maybe 100 feet from him when he's up there on the stage passing notes to Martin Luther King, and I'm a nobody from no place, and just trying to get a good look at all these great people at the podium. It was a tremendous event, and another thing that really struck me that I've stayed in my mind is that it was also a well-managed event. There were all these rules about you can only sing certain songs, you can only bring certain signs, all the stuff that Malcolm complained about later, that it was a an event managed by the leaders to make sure that there was no violence and that there was no militancy. I mean, you know, all the people who spoke on the stage, they had to have their speeches cleared. But in the midst of this, I remember this one group that was weaving through the crowd. You know, everybody else was kind of walking, you know, it wasn't even walking very fast or with a lot of energy. But there was this one group kind of weaving throughout, singing not just We Shall Overcome, but lots of other songs, and they were wearing overalls. And that was the group from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So even then, there was this presence, this energy that was coming from Mississippi that was not apparent in all the other people like myself who were there probably participating in our first demonstration. After the march, Stokely goes back to college at Howard to finish up his last year. But that's also the year that the organization of the Mississippi Summer Project takes place. And from your readings, you should be aware that that became a source of controversy. The emergence of Allard Lowenstein, who was the Stanford dean, who went south to help the movement. He comes in the summer of '63 after the assassination of Medgar Evers. And there's a number of demonstrations that take place. And in the course of those demonstrations, Lowenstein puts forward the idea of a freedom vote in Mississippi. The freedom vote, he got that idea from Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia. And because people couldn't vote, they had staged an election as a protest election, where people could come and show that they wanted to vote, if that were legally possible. Well, Lowenstein wanted to do the same thing in Mississippi. And he felt that this was a way of getting around what many Southerners, white Southerners were saying is that, well, the reason why black people aren't voting is they just don't want to. They just don't want to go down and go through the work of registering to vote. So he felt that this would be a good way of communicating to people that this was not the reason. So he came back to Stanford, fall of 1963, and began to recruit Stanford students to come, and a few, maybe a dozen or so Stanford students went in the fall of 1963 to help with the freedom vote. And it's during this time that they also began to say, well, why don't we do a much bigger effort in the summer of 1964? So at the same time, Lowenstein is trying to get white students to go. People like Stokely Carmichael are trying to recruit black students to go. And there really hasn't been a good accounting of the way in which these two parallel efforts, one of them had a great deal more success. That is, there were maybe 1,000 white students who came south for the summer of 1964. Versus a few dozen black students. Part of the reason was financial. I actually went to one of the planning meetings that took place in New Orleans in December of 1963, and that's where I first met Bob Moses. And it also, at that time, they began to discuss how the summer project was going to be held. And even at that meeting, there was a lot of effort to get people like myself to commit. Many of the black students who did go ended up actually as project directors if they had had movement experience. So a lot of them who came out of Howard ended up as project directors of these various things because the younger, the white students who came in usually came in without any kind of Southern experience. Now, I would have probably been in half of one camp and half of the other since I had not had any real Southern experience. But I remember, again, being very impressed with Bob Moses and also the contrast between Bob Moses and Stokely Carmichael. I mean, I can't think of two more different personalities. Bob Moses You've seen him on the screen, how quiet, soft-spoken, everyone respected his courage, the way in which he would always project other people as leaders, kind of following the Ella Baker idea. Stokely Carmichael, probably at the other extreme, very dynamic, charismatic, a leader himself and kind of self-confident about that. But in the context of the Southern movement, Bob Moses was the boss. And you also see in the accounts of the Mississippi summer how there is some tension between Stokely Carmichael as a project director in Greenwood and Bob Moses as the overall director. But it's very clear Stokely Carmichael, this is his first time on the SNCC staff. He's not going to challenge Bob Moses. And he is probably one of the best organizers SNCC had that summer. And he really believed in that idea of trying to develop leadership qualities in other people. Later on, when I did the research for the SNCC book, I went back to Greenwood, interviewed many of the people that he had worked with, and all of them expressed an enormous admiration for Stokely's role during that summer. Well, the summer project of 1964 is the beginning of Stokely's emergence as a force within SNCC, because that's when he joins the SNCC staff. Now, the summer is also a crucial turning point for the movement, because what happens at the end of the summer? Everybody goes to Atlantic City for the Democratic National Convention. At the end of that, there's this compromise, which the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party rejects the compromise offered by Johnson. And what is the result of that? Well, for many of the SNCC workers, that led to an increasing disillusionment with the Democratic Party, of no longer trusting liberal Democrats. When the crunch came, the feeling was many of their allies disappeared because they wanted to be affiliated with Lyndon Johnson and his reelection, and they felt that that was the way of power. So there, you have this split between liberals and what later become radicals, radicals in the movement. Needless to say, by this time, my sympathies were with the radicals, that's where I wanted to be. It was, by that time, I still wanted to finish college, but I wanted to get closer to movement activity. I had a sister living in LA, so I decided to transfer to UCLA. So I ended up in LA in 1965 at the same time this transition, actually in 64, the same time this transition is taking place. For the people in SNCC, the 64-65 period is a period of transition. They know that they want to develop an alternative to liberalism, but they don't know what that alternative is. They know that it has to kind of come out of the work that they're doing in the South. Part of it is, in the In Struggle book, you kind of get a picture of how that transition takes place. I call it turning inward. And what happens during that period is an enormous amount of internal debate goes on within the movement. And that ferment is something that's happening nationwide. So I felt it in LA in a group called the Nonviolent Action Committee, NVAC, which was kind of the SNCC equivalent in LA. We were all influenced by Malcolm X. And you recall that Malcolm X, from my previous lecture, he's making inroads into SNCC, inviting SNCC people. All of us developed a greater and greater admiration for what Malcolm was doing, primarily because he left the Nation of Islam. Because before that, there was a feeling of, who is this guy? Why is he criticizing us? We're the ones putting our bodies on the line. He's up there in New York talking about self-defense. Why doesn't he send his followers into Birmingham and practice self-defense there? But by 1964, Malcolm is basically telling his followers, you need to get more involved in the struggle. And he sent some of his followers into Mississippi to work with SNCC. At the same time, SNCC people, many of them who had come from urban areas, some of them from the north, but many of them from urban areas, had said, we can't just concentrate on the rural South. Mississippi, the Delta of Mississippi is important, but if we're really about building up grassroots leadership, well, now's the time to turn over the Mississippi movement to that grassroots leadership. Let the Mississippi people carry on that struggle, and let's go to places where the struggle has not begun. Where is that? The Black Belt of Alabama and urban areas in the north. So it's in the spring of 1965, during the Selma to Montgomery March, Stokely Carmichael goes into Lowndes County, Alabama, with a very small number of organizers. Lowndes County is in the center of Alabama. It's on the way between Selma and Montgomery. It's rural. It's predominantly black. It's an area where almost no black, I think at that time there were actually no black people registered to vote. Maybe maybe a few. So it was a difficult place to go into. I mean, during the Lowndes County struggle, people would get killed, and the dangers were enormous. I think I mentioned earlier in this class, when I went there to do research, it was still kind of, even with a black sheriff, you still felt that way out on those roads, no one would know when you would disappear. And I don't know if it's even changed today. It would be interesting to kind of go back there, how much of it has really changed. There's been a book about it, and that kind of makes the point that Lowndes County is an area that hasn't changed very much from the Reconstruction period. The only thing that's different is that many black people have left it to find better opportunities elsewhere. But in any case, what he did, what Stokely Carmichael did there, is to take the ideas of grassroots leadership. After all, with a small number of organizers, you're not going to be the leaders. You have to find the leaders. Working with local people in the Lowndes County area, and developing the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And you're probably familiar with the story of how the Democratic Party on the ballot had the white rooster as its symbol. So the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, they wanted to be not just an unofficial party like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, but a real official party. They wanted to be on the ballot and be able to run candidates in the general election. So they chose as their symbol the Black Panther. And that was the origin, because that name kind of got picked up as the Black Panther Party. And a pamphlet about the Lowndes County Freedom Organization found its way into the hands of Bobby Seale and Huey Newton out in Oakland, and that's where they picked up the idea of forming their own Black Panther Party. Well, what made the Black Panther Party unique was that it was independent of the Democratic Party. That sent a message to the Democratic Party that, we're not just organizing black people to join the Democratic Party. I mean, joining the Republican Party was completely out of the question. But joining the Democratic Party, That was the expectation of the Johnson administration, because after all, he had said that part of the whole strategy of the Voting Rights Act was that, yes, you're going to lose a lot of the white South by affiliating with civil rights, but new black voters will come on the rolls, and presumably they will vote Democratic, so the change will not be as he felt that you would really lose the South. And he said you'd lose the South for a generation, but you would gain black votes outside the South by supporting civil rights. Well, what Johnson was basically doing is setting the stage for the time from the 60s to the present. What Stokely Carmichael felt he was doing was carrying on the work of Malcolm X when he formed the Organization of African American Unity, because that was Malcolm X trying to develop a black political expression that would be independent of any political party, existing political party. Well, to some degree, the Black Panther Party in Lowndes County was an expression of that idea. Well, this takes us to the spring of 1965. I'm sitting out there in Los Angeles, going to school occasionally, mostly writing articles and participating in protests for the Nonviolent Action Committee. The way in which you qualified for membership was to get arrested, so unless you had been arrested, you couldn't be a member of the organization. And that helped solve lots of debates about whether to engage in protests, because unless you were willing to do that, you didn't have a vote. But another thing that had changed, though, was that increasingly we felt that we were just as much on the front lines as the people working in the South. The distinction was not between North and South anymore. It was between the kinds of work that you were doing. There was a Black Panther Party being formed in Los Angeles. There was an effort to break off South Central LA and form a what was to be called Freedom City. There was an effort to try to develop a more militant kind of politics that would focus more on jobs issues, employment issues. NVAC's main goal was to try to increase black employment at places where black people shopped. Thrifty Mart, which was a market chain, was one of our targets. So that was the kind of work that we were doing in the spring of 1965. What happens in the summer of 65? Okay, what we would call the Watts Rebellion. And here, for many of us, we felt for a while that even though we were on the front lines hadn't quite found us. But with Watts, we felt, okay, now this is where the struggle is. For many people like myself, it was a confusing time because we had been trained and experienced in terms of using the tactics of the struggle. We felt that we were more militant. We were kind of not committed to the philosophical ideas behind nonviolence, but we were still basically using those tactics, the picketing, sit-ins, things like that. Then suddenly, the NVAC headquarters on Central Avenue, one day we walk out the front door and people are breaking into stores. Later on that evening, as far as you can see in either direction, everything was burning. This was unprecedented. I mean, now I guess you would probably be more familiar with the more recent LA uprising. It probably is something that's part of your experience, but at the time in 1965, we had never seen anything like this. And we didn't know. We thought it was the beginning of a revolution. I mean, it was, people were not only taking over, but you would see police on the street, and they would drive up, and you would see the police watching people breaking into stores and not being able to do anything about it. And that kind of sense of the impotency of police, who we all had a tremendous dislike for, the LA police, this was an incident that really forced us to re-examine our assumptions. After that, the election in Lowndes County takes place, and the Lowndes County Freedom Organization doesn't win, but succeeds tremendously, comes very close to winning, and it's quite clear that in the next election they're going to succeed in taking over the county. Well, that leads us to the spring of 1966, when Stokely Carmichael becomes the chair of SNCC. And that election, which I describe in the book, so I'm not going to go through it, it's a very contentious election. Just to summarize, basically what happens is that everyone assumes that John Lewis is going to be reelected as chair. Because who's going to oppose him? You know, no one disagrees that he's very brave and all of that. But there is some sense that SNCC needs a different kind of face. So there is discussion about his leadership. And that discussion eventually leads to Stokely Carmichael being put forward as an alternative candidate. And this debate becomes increasingly rancorous within the organization. So much so that most of the people, by the time of the actual election, leave. And Stokely Carmichael was elected chair of SNCC by a vote of 17-16. Because with lots of people basically abstaining, saying, you know, whatever you guys want, because SNCC had never really cared very much about leaders. And leaders had always, it had almost been a dirty word to call somebody a leader. Because in the ethos of Bob Moses, who wants to be a leader? You want to be an organizer. Well, Stokely Carmichael becomes chair. And immediately, the press begins to focus on him, especially after the Mississippi March of 1966. This is a march through Mississippi after James Meredith is shot. James Meredith wanted to march through Mississippi in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act, saying that black people have nothing to fear. Well, you know, he gets a little outside of Memphis into Mississippi and he gets shot. Well, clearly, that's not the message you want to send if you are in favor of voting rights. So all the leaders come to Memphis and meet and decide that they need to carry on the march. This is where the tensions begin to develop between Stokely Carmichael, Floyd McKissick, the leader of CORE, and the leader of the NAACP, Roy Wilkins. They basically tell Roy Wilkins that they want to carry on this march, take it into Mississippi, and Wilkins, with some support from King, basically say, yeah, this should be another Selma to Montgomery march. And what did he mean by that? Well, the Selma to Montgomery march, the call went out for support, and who responded to that support? It was basically white religious people who were the most likely to come immediately and participate in the Selma to Montgomery march. They were in the front lines. Well, that's not the kind of march that Stokely Carmichael wanted in Mississippi. He wanted to send a message that this was now a black struggle. with black people in the forefront. King came down strongly on the side of having an integrated march. And King won. I mean, Stokely Carmichael, at this time, he's been elected like 3 weeks. He's not going to stand up to King and say what kind of a march it's going to be. So King wins the argument, but I think Stokely won the war. That is, because as soon as the march begins, each night they stop at various places, and there's a rally to try to get people to vote. During this rally, Stokely Carmichael spoke, Floyd McKissick, Dr. King. Roy Wilkins decides to abandon the whole thing. He doesn't want any part of it. And as the march goes further and further into Mississippi, the speeches become more divided over questions of how the movement should be organized, whether it should be a black-led struggle. And part of this comes from a guy named Willie Ricks. Willie Ricks is one of the organizers, SNCC organizers, who is sent ahead to prepare the way for the marchers. You need to send an advance representatives to tell the people that the march is coming, get out, this is what's going to happen. Willie Ricks was one of the firebrands in SNCC. In one of my earlier classes, times I taught this class, I got Willie Ricks in to speak to the students, and even on the Stanford campus, he was the organizer. Probably look at a class like this and try to get some of you to quit school and join the movement. And this was in the probably early '80s, so he's still very much active. Well, yes. Yes, he is still very much active. I don't even know where he is at the moment. If he might be on the continent in Africa. I'm not sure. I haven't seen him for probably about 10 years. In any case, Willie Ricks begins to use a phrase from the Lowndes County movement: "We want black power for black people." And he finds that the use of the term black power got a special response from the black audiences where he used it. And he would come back and start talking to Stokely Carmichael and say, guess what? I'm out there, and whenever I say black power, people go wild. And you've got to start using it. And Stokely Carmichael kind of reacts skeptically, that this. And it's only after Stokely gets arrested in Greenwood. It's the two things that I think come together. One is he gets arrested and he's angry. Number two, where is he? He's right where he had been an organizer in 1964. So he already has people who know him, who he knows the people he's working with, and he gets up and starts shouting, "What do we want? Black power." And gets that response from the crowd. King is stunned, kind of doesn't know how quite to respond to this. But that's the beginning of the black power controversy, because the press, of course, are following this. And one of the things that the press will do, even today, is whenever they sense a disagreement among black leaders, they will take it and run with it, and now we have a major split in the black leadership. And what happened after that was that Stokely Carmichael came from being an obscure SNCC organizer who only people in the movement knew about, to being really a household name, someone who was seen as a major challenger, and the person who kind of carried on the Malcolm legacy. There's an interesting article by a SNCC worker in which he calls it the angry children of Malcolm X. That is, those people who had listened to Malcolm, had kind of absorbed some of his arguments, and were now wanting to take those arguments into the black struggle. It was during this period that I reconnected with Stokely Carmichael. By that time, he came out to LA a number of times, spoke in Watts. I remember the first time he came out, it was in, I don't know, some of you might be, whether it's still called Will Rogers Park, but there's a major public park in the city. And we were able to get 5,000 people there, just on word of mouth to hear Stokely and get that message of black power. And one of the things that was true about the phrase was that it was just as powerful in the South as in the North. By the fall, I remember coming up with Stokely Carmichael to the Berkeley Black Power Conference that was held on the Berkeley campus in November of 1966. And actually, I was one of the warm-up speakers for Stokely Carmichael. I still have this poster that has Clay Carson, organizer from Watts. and then Stokely Carmichael kind of gave the headline speech. And that was interesting because that was the first exposure I had to the community alert patrols. Bobby Seale and Huey Newton also came to that conference, and this is right after they formed the Black Panther Party, and they're selling the Little Red Book with the quotations of Chairman Mao. And this, of course, identified them as being a Maoist group, but in reality, as Bobby Seale and Huey Newton later explained, what they were really doing was that they had got a shipment of these quotations of Chairman Mao, and they went on the Berkeley campus to sell them in order to get money to buy their first weapons. So that's how they bought their first guns, was by, so it wasn't so much the content of the book. They were basically being capitalists. They were buying these books at a very low price and going over to Berkeley and selling them at this conference. So Stokely Carmichael became the person who epitomized the Black Power slogan. My role at that point was kind of being both an activist and being a writer, writing articles about the emerging Black Power idea, usually for the LA Free Press, which was an underground newspaper in LA, but also increasingly for little magazines and different things that were coming out. Ramparts, which was a magazine that was widely circulated on college campuses at the time. So we were able to kind of reestablish contact, and during this time, I began to sense that there was a backlash against Stokely Carmichael. And it was largely over the question of leadership. For an organization that had never really respected leaders, here was, now the organization was all focused on Stokely Carmichael as the leader. So at the same time, there was an admiration for some of the ideas that he was putting forward. There was a feeling on the part of many of the organizers in SNCC that the projects were being neglected in favor of speech making. And that organizing, which had always been SNCC's strength, was declining. And that dilemma actually became, I think, the origins of why I decided ultimately to write about SNCC. Because if you'll notice at the end of the SNCC book, it's really about that dilemma of admiring the accomplishments of the organization, but also having some sense of ambivalence about where the organization was going as leaders began to contend for power during this period. And you saw a movement that had always been grassroots increasingly becoming a movement of competing leaders. Ron Karinga, Maulana Karinga in Los Angeles, who I also wrote about. Bob Moses by this time has kind of left because of the draft. He's off in Canada. So the people who are left are all people who see that now the movement has to move in this more militant direction, and I'm the one who's going to provide leadership as it moves. I'm going to be the next Malcolm X. And I felt increasingly that this was problematic. But at the same time, there was a sense of admiration for those people who were kind of coming and taking the movement into the urban centers. Probably the next stage of this came when Stokely Carmichael joined with the Black Panther Party. And there's a section in the SNCC book, and I won't kind of go through that, that was not a very, it did not end well. There was a real contradiction between SNCC as an organization and the Black Panther Party. Stokely ultimately cast his lot with the Black Panther Party, becoming prime minister, working with Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, basically saying that in his view, the Black Panther Party was the organization that was going to take the movement into the late 60s and early 70s. He finds that that was very difficult. The direction he wants to go is quite different from the direction that Bobby Seale and Huey Newton wanted to go. They clashed over the questions of black, for Stokely Carmichael, he felt that black people needed to organize on their own. For Bobby Seale and increasingly Eldridge Cleaver, as he comes in, they feel that Huey Newton's in jail. We need all the allies we can get. In California, that means white allies. We're going to make all the alliances we want. Stokely Carmichael, who's kind of been through the SNCC experience, says, you know, that's going to be problematic. You need to present to the black community a unified image of black people getting together. So they split over these kinds of questions. What happened to Stokely Carmichael? He ultimately decides to leave, go to Guinea to work with Kwame Nkrumah, the deposed leader of Ghana. After the CIA had overthrown him, he moves to Guinea to work with Sékou Touré, changes his name to Kwame Touré, and takes these two African leaders as his mentors. Stokely Carmichael also forms an organization, the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, which attracts people like Willie Ricks. He wants to form a Pan-African party, and that's where he spends the rest of his life before his death in the late 90s, working from the African continent, trying to build a Pan-African movement. He doesn't really succeed very well. You know, Africa becomes more and more divided during this period. The Kwame Nkrumah's ideal of unifying Africa under one government, we're probably even farther away from that today than we were back in the 1960s. Stokely Carmichael, though, never really gives up on that. The last times when I saw him, he would come to the Stanford campus. One of the things I wanted to print out when we were in my office, but the printer wasn't working, there's a picture of Stokely right over here at Green Library. And he would always be trying to recruit students for his All-African People's Revolutionary Party. He would never have very much success in doing that. And I think that part of it was that there was this sense amongst many students that this was just not, this was getting farther and farther from the everyday realities of black people in the United States. The people who he did recruit were the ones who were really drawn to the idea of Pan-Africanism. You know, that Du Boisian ideal that goes back to the beginning of the century, that if black people all around the world were able to unite, that it would be a very powerful force in the world. And perhaps that is true. But the question is, who's going to do the organizing, the grassroots organizing to make that happen? And you do have all these contending forces, both in the African American community, which leads to, by the end of the 1960s, conflict within the African American militant community, which I saw firsthand at UCLA when members of the Black Panther Party shot and killed members of US organizations shot and killed 2 members of the Black Panther Party right on the UCLA campus. So from 1969 on, this notion of that black power was going to be this idea, this vague idea that was somehow going to unify black people. You could see the error of that. And you began to understand that different people had different notions about what black power meant. Was it simply black consciousness? Was it black capitalism? Was it black revolution? Was it all of these things? Were they self-contradictory ideas? And I think that dilemma about we all seem to be electrified and brought together by the slogan Black Power, but the content of that slogan has remained elusive, even to today. So I think that to some degree, Stokely Carmichael's journey from organizer and campus activist at Howard University to the leading figure of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party is a journey that's very instructive, but I'm not exactly sure what are the long-term implications of his work. Perhaps Pan-Africanism will yet prevail, but it doesn't seem very likely at the moment. Any questions, comments? Yes.
Is it true that Stokely Carmichael got married to Miriam Makeba at some point? And
Yes, yes. He even at Howard, the first time, Harry Belafonte introduced him to Miriam Makeba back in the days when he was at Howard. Miriam Makeba was a South African singer, still is, still very active, and I think that he always had this sense that this would be a wonderful person to get together with. And when they first meet, he recalled that she just kind of like, and who are you? Because there was a lot of difference in their age too. And but then later on, when he moves to Africa, and after he becomes a major figure for Black Power, then they kind of get introduced again, and he really pursues her. And they ended up getting married, and to some degree that marriage was extremely symbolic. I mean, for a person who is Pan-African to marry a leading figure in the South African resistance movement. In fact, some of Stokely's friends always had the feeling, was this more of a political marriage, or was this but I'm certainly willing to accept I don't think he would marry somebody just for political reasons. But
and she suffered from it. She got blacklisted here.
Yeah, because she was very popular. Harry Belafonte kind of made her a popular figure as a folk singer. I guess that's the term they would use in the United States. And as Stokely Carmichael became prominent and very critical of the state of Israel, that he was charged with being anti-Semitic, and that apparently affected her career, that she got less invitations to sing in the United States because of all the controversy over his statements about Israel. Any other questions, Karen?
Can you talk more about the Freedom City and pulling away from South Central.
Yeah, I wrote this. It was an idea that kind of came out of Stokely's first speech in Watts, and maybe I'll put it. I'll post it for this class. I wrote this article that became kind of a front page article, "Black Power for Watts," and it was a call for dividing the city. Now, ironically, there's been a more recent movement to divide LA, but it's the white parts of LA wanting to secede from the rest of LA. Now the rest of LA has become kind of third world. So, but at that time, it was kind of a radical idea that maybe South Central LA would be better off as its own city. Now, there were a lot of critics that say, well, what's the economic base of this new city? So, I don't, look, I was a 23-year-old writing about all of these big issues, and I think that my job at that point was to try to throw out these ideas and try to get greater discussion about it. But it was something that I definitely learned from, and it never really went anywhere, let's put it this way. I mean, we didn't have very much, the only thing it really led to was more of on the part of black people in the city to exert more power, to get a black person elected to the city council, to form the black umbrella organization to bring together the different groups.
Ben, do you have any idea of how many All-African People Revolutionary Parties existed on campuses? Because I know there was a big group in Oakland and in Sacramento, study groups.
There was a group here. There was about 3 people. I stayed in touch with one of the students who joined it, but I don't know. I don't even know of anyone in the area who's still. Oh, you do?
Well, okay. She's up at Merritt College now, I think teaching in African Studies. Nehanda Imara. Yeah. But they used to meet monthly, regular, and like 30 to 50 people, and they would have big gatherings, and sometimes he would come.
Yeah. The last time I remember I invited Stokely to come to this campus, one of the things that was striking was that the turnout was about the size of this room. I mean, by that time he had really very few people had really were that familiar with him. He was still a very powerful speaker, but he just didn't have, of course by that time Jesse Jackson and other people had kind of become much more prominent. Okay, I should mention, to follow this discussion, Tuesday, I've invited Elaine Brown to come. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that name, but after Huey Newton was basically finished his tour as went into exile to Cuba from the Black Panther Party, Elaine Brown became the chairman of the Black Panther Party, and she led the Black Panther Party during most of the 1970s. She was someone who came in fairly early and emerged as by far the most powerful woman in the Black Panther Party. And so she will be speaking on Tuesday. And don't invite all your friends, but if you want to bring a few other people, that would be fine too. And 2 weeks from Tuesday, as already indicated on your syllabus, Erica Huggins, another member of the Black Panther Party, who led the Oakland Community Schools, in fact founded the Oakland Community School of the Black Panther Party, will be speaking in this class.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.